Hi, I am Chitra.
I am Madhvi.
I'm Jyoti.
I'm Suchitra.
Together, we are your hosts.
On the Edge podcast.
We bring you stories and experiences.
From our experiments around learning, marketing, and design.
These are stories of people, technology,
And people interacting through technology.
Of what we see, create,
and recommend.
Have you found yourself ordering the same menu item every time you visit your favorite restaurant? Do you find yourself accepting the default option in a strategic interaction or sticking to the current baseline or status quo when you are overwhelmed with choices? Listen on to find out what the status quo bias is and why we tend to leave things as they are.
Hi, Jyoti, and welcome to all our listeners on this episode of the Rarely Rational series, as we call it.
Hi Chitra, glad to be back with another episode.
So today we're going to explore between ourselves what the status quo bias or the default effect is. And we'll also take a look at how we've perceived it within ourselves, in our environment, why it happens, and what is it that professionals in the field of UX can take care of or be aware of when this bias comes into play. So, Jyoti, let me start by asking you a few simple questions. So, if I were to ask you, what's your favorite go-to comfort food? What would you say?
Dal and rice.
And then, let's say that, this weekend you had an opportunity to just get away with your family for the weekend. Do you know which place you're likely to go?
Nandi Hills.
Okay. So, I think those two questions are relatively easy responses, right? Because you knew what you wanted. But I was just wondering, what happened recently was that I had a bonus from a few investments, and suddenly I had this lump sum and was struggling to figure out where I should invest it. I spoke to my investment advisor and she gave me a few options. But yet, when I looked at my portfolio, I wanted to default to some of the options that were already existing there versus take a look at the 2 or 3 new options that my advisor had sent to me, make the effort of going through all of them, doing a comparison, and then making a decision. That's because I knew that my existing options that I had in my portfolio had given me decent returns in the past, but I did spend a good half day with this little tug of war going on in my head, and then I just finally defaulted to the default.
We tend to leave things as they are.
Yeah.
So this reminds me of example. Like recently, I had to renew my car insurance. The insurance broking company sent me a link with a list of insurance companies and their prices. I just took one look at the list and immediately went ahead with my existing insurance, without even giving a thought to look at other offers, even though they had better prices. Right? I guess this is another example for defaulting to the status quo. I didn't want to bother about making a new decision.
Yeah, I think where we're heading to is like the simpler questions or the relatively simpler questions like what our favorite food would be, which is a restaurant that we would love to go to all the time. I think they're very clear. For example, I know what color I want to paint my room if somebody were to ask me. But answering these questions or taking decisions around the questions that we just explored, I think are much harder. And that I think brings us to what the status quo bias is, which is a preference given to the present state of affairs or a natural bias towards the current or previous decision.
It seems like an emotional bias.
Yeah, it does. Because, someone said that the dilemma that we're faced with is that as humans, most of us don't like change. We love it at the same time. And we really want for things to remain the same, but at the same time get better. No wonder we call this podcast Rarely Rational.
There's a conundrum right there.
Yeah.
Where you want better things, but you are not really ready to make difficult decisions.
Yeah. And I think, what revealed itself in the 2 instances that you and I spoke about just now, where you took the default choice with respect to your car insurance and I defaulted to the investment options that I already had, was basically a loss aversion and trying to avoid a choice paralysis, not being too overwhelmed with the number of choices, which are 2 distinct characteristics of this particular bias that manifest in people and the decisions they make and the choices they make.
I think we assign greater weight to the potential losses that could result in making an alternative choice than to its potential gains, right?
Yeah.
That's what loss aversion would mean.
Yeah, and there's also a transactional cost, right? So, for example, my kids have a good time laughing at me whenever they see my extreme pain, frustration, and anxiety when I have to change over to a new phone. And even before the phone arrives home, I'm already thinking about how much time I have to set aside to transfer data from my old phone to the new phone, how much time I need to make sure everything is working, what all do I need, what are the list of apps that I have on my old phone that I absolutely need to have on my new phone, and all of that. And then, of course, there is, okay, if it was a transition within the same brand to a newer model, I think that was somewhat simpler. But there's always the excitement and curiosity about testing a new brand, and that comes with its own onboarding challenges, I'd say. Because every phone has, well, there are some basic features that work pretty much the same across all devices, but then there are those that are unique. For example, brand A has its own default options that you need to get familiar with and so on. It's a laugh riot for others at home while they see me struggling, and I'm always worried, did I miss out on something? Even though, let's say, I set aside typically half a day to do this whole transition, it takes me a good 1 week or 15 days to finally feel comfortable with the new phone. And then, of course, at the end of the month, you realize suddenly in the middle of a call that, hey, the silent button on this phone is completely different from what it was on my previous phone. And then you have to excuse yourself from the meeting, step out, actually switch off your phone and do something as absurd. So that transaction cost, I think, is another reason for why the status quo bias manifests. And what I would do is just try and drag on as long as possible to use my old phone as far as it would go, rather than switching over to a new phone.
Is it also like people stop themselves from making a more advantageous option out of like fear of failure in certain cases where you perhaps have more to lose, or it's assumed that there is more to lose?
Yes, I think people do that as well. I think there is something called regret avoidance, if I recall right, alongside loss aversion. And it's also a question of why should I take that risk? So if I go back to some of our episodes, our cognitive responses developed in responses to the threats around us. So I think some of that also still operates, where we perceive any change or something that we are not familiar with as a potential threat. That will cause us some emotional despair at the end of it. And then, of course, today, I think we mentioned this briefly in the previous episode as well, is that we are overwhelmed with so many choices. And this happens to me all the time when I'm trying to shop online, is that the very fact that it says, along with this, people also bought this. And very often I find myself actually panicking, saying, I don't even want to see it. I just want what I want. Please don't show me more and more things.
I can imagine that. Totally.
And then I find myself going in circles and very often thinking I'd spend far less time if I walked into a shop, saw what I wanted, bought that, paid the bill and walked out, versus sitting in front of a screen for hours, not able to, make up my mind simply because I'm overwhelmed with the number of choices that I have. And I often feel that at the end of it, I come away feeling that it was a waste of time, or, how much time have I spent aimlessly browsing?
But I think the modern, even the brick and mortar stores, the supermarkets have also figured out how to, use this against consumers, where they package similar items together and they keep it on shelves where you're like, okay, you buy this and then, oh, maybe I need this too. You're not as lost as in an online shopping environment, but still there is a way for you to at least get lost in maybe these large supermarkets where they use this.
That's true. I mean, it's not that they have less of a choice. It's not that maybe you're expending that much less energy there. But what you said is very true. And I think another way where we see a lot of the status quo bias manifesting is, I think, in personal care products like shampoos and skin products. You're so used to it where, and I remember that, everybody gave so much focus and there was so much hype around a particular brand of toothpaste. Of course, because it was endorsed by a lot of people in white coats. Yet, once you started using it, you found it very difficult to break away from that particular brand of toothpaste because you had the sense of security that it was actually doing good to your teeth and gums and so on. Whereas you were receiving perhaps conflicting information or too much information about other brands that were saying that the one that you're using is really not that good. So there again you see cognitive miserliness of the brain wanting to default to a status quo and just trying to keep things the way they are.
In fact, I read that scientists have examined the neural pathways involved in status quo bias, and they found that the human brain finds it tougher to take action when the decision to be made is perceived to be more difficult. We are also tending towards inaction just because you can't make a more critical decision and you stick to the default.
Yeah, in fact, I think a lot of that plays into how user experience design and researchers, into what they go through rather. Especially, I've seen, there's people are trying to introduce a new feature in a product, and the user experience researchers are trying to talk to a group of customers and very clearly are noticing that there is a reluctance, there is a resistance to change, and they really don't want to come back and tell the product team that, hey, these guys don't really like it. So, whereas internally their objective tests that they have conducted have revealed that the newer feature is perhaps the better option. So, I think in such cases, how do UX researchers really beat the bias? So, based on my experience, I've seen that if you're able to sort of tell a before story and an after story in a way that doesn't appear that you're selling it, because that's a different kettle of fish altogether, and contrast it very clearly between the as-is and to-be states. Right? I think that's one thing that UX researchers can deploy when they are doing either interviews or talking to existing customers before including a new feature. Because customers do tend to get put off. For example, we all know that if there is a slight change in a user interface on an app or a product that we were so used to using, it just frustrates us, right? And you're worried. You're suddenly worried. What's happening here? Am I giving away too much data? What am I doing?
Yeah. Why is this button not in the place that always used to be in?
Absolutely. The other thing that's also happening now is ever since the data privacy laws came into effect, and you find that almost every second website that you visit has the cookie setting and the disclaimer policy. I wonder how many of us actually go and click through and see. So in the way I've been testing it is because nearly every website is doing is I actually take that minute, go and open it, and if you see, the only thing that they have on is strictly necessary cookies. Of course, now what are strictly necessary cookies is not something that every website discloses, and I think, if I may say, Facebook exploited this to some extent in 2009 when it came to their privacy policy, and most people used the default option there. But nevertheless, that's my grouse right now, is what are strictly necessary cookies. And all the other ones are the ones that you can turn off, except that. And at the same time, I've also observed that when you say no thank you, when you don't accept it, you can still continue to find the information that you need on that page. So those are some of the things that I've personally done to try and beat my own bias. But I think if user researchers, one tip for them is to tell the before and after story and actually leave that with the users.
I think that is more ethical in using this status quo bias for consumers, right?
Yeah. In fact, I think that's in the interest of knowing or getting first-hand information from users. You understand that they are resistant to change, but you also know that introducing this new feature is beneficial to them and the product. So I think it empowers the product team to be able to take more informed decisions.
I think I came across this term called the framing effect. That's how you frame the default option as a loss. So you're projecting another option that you want the consumer to take as a better option.
Yeah.
So that way you would give the choice to the consumer and help them make a decision instead of just sticking to the status quo.
It's interesting you said that, because the second point was to actually have a default option to reduce the burden of choice. And I'm going to go back to the browser security policy options to say that if only people took the pains to say what strictly necessary cookies were, I think I'd do a lot less of what I was doing. So, but the tendency to view the default option as the most popular choice is something that people will demonstrate if there is a default option. So that is something that can be used by user experience designers to reduce the burden of choice.
Yeah, I think that is one of the pros of sticking to the status quo. The default choice is better in cases where time can be spent in making more important decisions, freeing up your mental resources, right?
Definitely. And the third thing that UX people can also look at is remove rather than add to the plan.
Yes.
Right? So in some sense, that is also reducing the burden of choice. Yet some people may call it simplifying, right? The number of options that they have. So let's say that if there was a situation where you had a number of steps to follow to configure something, if there is always the principles of abstraction that one could apply to make things simpler, and that could be shown to users, saying that you are not losing anything, you are not, in fact, you are going to save time, and we have effectively reduced the number of steps that you need to configure something. So one of the good things that I've noticed over the last couple of years on e-commerce sites is, the fact that I remember back in the day you had your billing address and shipping address, you actually had to painstakingly type it. Whereas now, at least, should I use
The same address
for billing and shipping? Right? It's just making things simpler. And earlier, if you had to apply codes or if you were getting discounts, you had to go back and forth from the checkout screen. That has also been minimized now. So there have been these small steps that people can take where you can reduce the complexity. So coming back to point number 3, it's remove rather than add to a plan.
Yeah, I think this feature can also be used in a dubious way, where if you're taking, for example, the instance of installing a software and you have already a certain list of items already checked, and you wouldn't notice that there's a small thing, it's also checked to install a piece of software that you don't want. And you just say okay until the last screen, and then voila, you have something that you don't want along with what you had selected, right? So I think that is where you can see like a dark pattern you introduced.
Yeah, I think, personally, if you ask me, this is something that when UX folks are doing wireframing and prototyping, you can actually make things a little more clearer, things a little more transparent, which is something that users are largely looking forward to today, and place it appropriately such that it's visible in the path of their user journey at the point when they are going to actually complete a transaction or take a decision. I think that's something to consider. So I think I'd like to add this as a fourth point here, is that consider using different methods and techniques together in user research. Just don't default to using a single technique. Which could be either only doing user interviews or only relying on surveys. Try to enrich the whole discovery of the user persona, their needs, their pains, and so on, by using techniques like a day in the life of and the customer journey. And then putting all these together and then deciding how you want to improve the product or how you want to build a new product. So I think we've covered quite a bit in this Rarely Rational series with respect to biases that could influence decision making, right? And that was what these 4 episodes were about. So thank you very much, Jyoti. And I would also tell our listeners that periodically we will be covering groups of 4 biases under the series called Rarely Rational as part of the Edge podcast. And we hope you find these useful and helpful. So thank you very much, Jyoti. Again.
Thank you, Chitra.
Please subscribe to the Edge podcast on your favorite podcast channel. We are on Google, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and more. If you liked this episode, please share it with your friends. If you have stories to share and want to be featured on our podcast, write to us at podcasts@adepticlabs.com.